The call came at 7:42 p.m., right as I was lighting the last anniversary candle. "Is this Rebecca?" The woman's voice on the other end was soft but cold, each word deliberate and sharp. "Yes, who's calling?" I balanced my phone between ear and shoulder, adjusting the sterling silver candlesticks my mother had given Daniel and me for our wedding. 10 years ago today. The dining room looked perfect, the good china gleaming under the chandelier light, the bottle of 2008 Barolo breathing on the eye table, Daniel's favorite prime rib resting before carving. "My name is Vanessa. I thought you should know that your husband won't be making it home for your anniversary dinner tonight." A pause, deliberate and cruel. "He's with me. He's been with me for months now. And he swore he'd finally leave you. Tonight." The room tilted briefly, crystal and silver blurring into fractured light. I steadied myself against the mahogany table, feeling its solid weight anchor me as this stranger's words hung in the air between us. "I see," I managed, my voice somehow still conveying the calm that years in a courtroom had taught me to project, regardless of the chaos erupting inside me. "And you're calling to tell me this because—" A bitter laugh echoed through the phone. "Because I'm tired of waiting. Because he promised me tonight was the night he'd finally tell you everything. But now he's in the shower at my place, getting ready for dinner, talking about how he needs to handle things delicately with you. So I thought I'd speed things along." I glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner, the Federalist piece we'd found at an estate sale in Vermont when we were first married. Daniel should have been home 40 minutes ago. His texts about being caught in a meeting suddenly took on new meaning. "I appreciate the courtesy call," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice remained. "Is there anything else?" My response clearly wasn't what she expected. The momentary silence confirmed that. "Aren't you going to cry or scream or something?" Vanessa finally asked, sounding almost disappointed. "Would that make this more enjoyable?" "For you?" I asked, running my finger along the edge of Daniel's favorite crystal tumbler, the one I'd filled with 2 fingers of Macallan 18, waiting for him beside his plate. "I just thought you should know what kind of man you're married to," she snapped. "He tells me everything, Rebecca. About your cold ambition, your obsession with your career, how you're never there for him emotionally, how the spark died years ago." Each accusation was meant to cut, and despite my outward composure, they did. 10 years of marriage, of building a life together, reduced to character assassinations delivered by a stranger who believed she knew me through the lens of my husband's apparent dissatisfaction. "Does he also tell you about his gambling problem?" I asked quietly. "Or about how his business is failing? Or perhaps about the offshore accounts?" This time, the silence stretched longer. "You're making that up," Vanessa finally said, but doubt had crept into her voice. "Am I? Ask him about Macau, about the property he remortgaged without my knowledge, about the investors who've been calling our home at all hours." I twisted my wedding ring absently, feeling the weight of the 3-carat diamond that had seemed so impressive when Daniel had proposed. Back when I believed his family fortune was as substantial as he'd claimed? Before I discovered the smoke and mirrors that comprised much of my husband's carefully constructed image. "I don't believe you," Vanessa said, but the certainty had drained from her voice. "You don't have to. Just check his phone when he's in the shower. Look at the banking app he keeps under a calculator icon. Ask yourself why a supposedly wealthy investment manager needs to borrow money so frequently." I moved to the window, looking out at our Beacon Hill brownstones view of the Boston Common. The trees were just beginning to turn, hints of gold and amber catching the early evening light. How many autumn evenings had Daniel and I spent walking through those paths? How many confidences shared, dreams planned, promises made, and, at least on my part, kept? "Why are you telling me this?" Suspicion now colored Vanessa's tone. Professional courtesy, I suppose. One woman to another. I reached for the Barolo, pouring myself a generous glass. You mentioned Daniel talks about my career. Did he happen to mention what I do? Something in law. Corporate, I think. I allowed myself a small smile. Not exactly. I'm with the Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI, specializing in securities fraud and money laundering. The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me everything. That's not... He never said, no. I don't imagine he did. I took a sip of wine, letting the rich complexity wash over my palate. Daniel has always been selective about the truths he shares. You're lying, she said, but uncertainty made her voice waver. The same way he's been lying to you about leaving me tonight? For months now, according to you. The line went quiet, and I wondered if she'd hung up. Then, in a much smaller voice, "What are you going to do?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for months, ever since I'd discovered the first discrepancies in our finances, followed by the late-night calls, the unexplained absences, the unfamiliar cologne that occasionally clung to his shirts. I'd been gathering evidence, building a case the way I'd been trained to do, methodically, dispassionately, professionally. But there had been nothing professional about the pain that accompanied each new discovery, each confirmation that the man I'd built my life with was not who he claimed to be. "What am I going to do?" I repeated, looking at the anniversary dinner growing cold. "I'm going to finish this excellent Barolo. Then I'm going to make some calls. After that..." I paused, the weight of my next words settling over me with surprising lightness. "After that, Daniel's fate is out of my hands." "What does that mean?" "It means the Bureau has been building a case against my husband for months. It means I've been recused from the investigation, but required to maintain my normal behavior to avoid tipping him off. It means that while he's been playing both of us, a dozen agents have been tracking his movements, documenting his transactions, and preparing warrants." My voice remained calm, but inside, a storm of emotions raged. Betrayal at Daniel's infidelity layered atop the professional disgust at his crimes, all amplified by the shattered illusion of the life I thought we'd built together. Tonight's anniversary dinner wasn't just a celebration, I continued. It was a final opportunity for him to come clean, to cooperate voluntarily before things got worse. But it appears he's made his choice. I heard a door opening on Vanessa's end, followed by a familiar voice, Daniel's voice, calling out something indistinct in the background. "I have to go," Vanessa whispered urgently. "Of course," I replied. "But Vanessa, when they come, and they will come, anything you know, anything you've helped him hide, now would be the time to start thinking about your own future." She hung up without another word. I set down my phone and moved methodically around the dining room, extinguishing the candles one by one. The smoke twisted upward in thin gray ribbons, dissipating into nothing. Much like the marriage I had believed in until 7:42 p.m., I picked up my secure work phone from the sideboard drawer and dialed a number I knew by heart. "It's Donovan," I said when the line connected. "Operation Glasshouse is active. My location is secure, and I'll remain on-site as discussed." "Understood," Assistant Director Whitman replied. "Teams are in position. Timeline for execution is approximately 40 minutes. Are you certain you want to be there when we bring him in?" I looked at the anniversary portrait hanging over the mantel. Daniel and me on a sailboat in Nantucket, wind in our hair, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling as though the future stretched endless and bright before us. "I'm certain," I said, my voice now purely professional. "After a decade of marriage, I need to see his face when he realizes who I really am." After ending the call, I moved to my home office, unlocking the hidden panel behind the antique Maritime. Map Daniel had given me our first Christmas together. Inside was a safe that he didn't know existed, containing everything I'd need for tonight and the difficult days to follow. My badge, my service weapon, copies of financial records, passport, and the emergency cash reserve I'd maintained since. joining the bureau. I checked my watch. 35 minutes until the raid. The teams would be gathering now, reviewing final details, checking equipment, preparing to move on multiple locations simultaneously. Daniel's office downtown, the marina, where his boat was docked, the storage facility rented under his mother's maiden name, and, of course, Vanessa's apartment, where Daniel was currently preparing for a dinner that would never happen. My phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel, working late. Don't wait up. Sorry about anniversary. We'll make it up to you this weekend. The familiar lie sent a wave of cold anger through me. How many times had I received essentially this same message? How many special occasions had been sacrificed to his work, which I now knew consisted of elaborate financial schemes and, apparently, building a relationship with his mistress? I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I returned to the dining room and poured the remainder of the Barolo into my glass. I raised it in a silent toast to the end of illusions, to the beginning of truth, however painful. 10 years ago today, I had stood before family and friends and pledged my life to Daniel. I had believed in him, in us, in the future we would build together. I had entrusted him with my heart, my dreams, my truth. And all the while, he had been constructing an intricate fabrication, both of himself and of our marriage. I moved to the living room window, watching as unmarked government vehicles began to take positions along our quiet, tree-lined street. To any neighbors glancing out, they might appear to be nothing more than visitors attending a dinner party, or perhaps rideshare drivers waiting for passengers. But I knew better. I recognized the subtle coordination, the practiced casualness, that masked absolute precision. In my earpiece, which I'd retrieved from the safe along with my badge, I could hear the team leaders checking in, confirming positions, reporting readiness. The operation that had been months in the planning was now minutes from execution. I thought about the moment I had first suspected something was wrong. Not the affairs, those had come later, but the financial discrepancies, the documents that didn't quite align, the inconsistencies in Daniel's explanations about certain transactions. I remembered the sick feeling in my stomach when I'd taken my concerns to Assistant Director Whitman, knowing what it would mean for both my career and my marriage. Your priority is to maintain normalcy while we investigate, Whitman had instructed. If he's involved in what we suspect, any change in your behavior could alert him. For now, you're still his wife, not an agent. Can you do that, Donovan? I had assured him I could. And I had, attending charity galas on Daniel's arm, hosting dinner parties for his clients, maintaining the fiction of our perfect marriage while the evidence of his crimes mounted in classified files I wasn't permitted to access. It had been the most challenging undercover role of my career. And it had hollowed me out, day by day, lie by lie. The grandfather clock began to chime, marking the arrival of 8 o'clock. In my earpiece, I heard the command I'd been waiting for. All units, execute now. I repeat, execute now. I moved to the center of the living room, badge now visible on my belt, and waited for the carefully orchestrated operation to unfold. Teams would be breaching Vanessa's apartment at this exact moment. Daniel would be caught entirely by surprise, perhaps still with the flush of the shower on his skin, the lies for his evening prepared but not yet delivered. Other agents would be seizing documents from his office, securing his boat, opening the storage unit where we believed additional evidence was hidden. My role now was to secure our residence and wait, to be present when they brought Daniel home in handcuffs to collect his passport and witness the search of his home office, to stand as both the betrayed wife and the federal agent who had helped build the case that would send him to prison. I had imagined this moment differently in the early days of the investigation. I had pictured confronting Daniel myself, demanding explanations, perhaps even breaking down as the dual betrayals of our marriage and of the law became impossible to deny. But Vanessa's call had changed something. Her assumption that I was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle, a cold, career-obsessed wife who deserved to be abandoned on her anniversary, had crystallized something inside me. The last remnants of sentimentality had evaporated, replaced by a steely resolve to see this through with the professionalism that had defined my career. Daniel had underestimated me in every possible way. He had dismissed my intelligence, my instincts, my dedication to both justice and truth. He had assumed I would either never discover his deceptions or would be too emotionally compromised to act on them. He had forgotten, or perhaps had never, truly understood who I was beyond the role of his wife. My phone rang again. Not Daniel this time, but Assistant Director Whitman. "We have him in custody," he said without preamble. "The mistress's apartment was exactly where you said it would be. He surrendered without incident, but he's demanding to speak with his lawyer, and with you." Me? I couldn't help the surprise in my voice. "He keeps insisting there's been a mistake, that you can explain everything." Whitman's tone conveyed his skepticism. "The transport team will bring him by the residence in approximately 20 minutes for the scheduled search. Are you still prepared for that?" I looked around the room, at the life Daniel and I had built. Or rather, at the life I had believed we were building together. The carefully selected furniture, the art collected during our travels, the photographs documenting a decade of shared experiences. All of it beautiful, and all of it built on a foundation of lies. "I'm prepared," I confirmed. "Has he been informed of my role?" "Not explicitly. We felt that should come from you." "I understand. I'll be ready." As I ended the call, I caught my reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. I looked remarkably composed for a woman whose marriage had just imploded spectacularly. My dark hair was still smoothly styled in the chignon I'd carefully arranged for our anniversary dinner. Charcoal gray dress, selected to complement the burgundy tie I'd recently given Daniel, hung elegantly on my frame. Only my eyes betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface, dark and fathomless with the knowledge of what was to come. I moved to the dining room and methodically began clearing the anniversary dinner I'd prepared. The prime rib, never carved. The roasted vegetables, now cold. The potatoes au gratin, congealed in their dish. I wrapped each item carefully, placing them in the refrigerator with the precision that had served me well throughout my career. Evidence collected. Scene secured. Emotions contained. In approximately 15 minutes, my husband would be escorted into our home in handcuffs. He would see me not as Rebecca, the devoted wife, but as Special Agent Rebecca Donovan of the Financial Crimes Unit. He would understand, finally, that while he had been deceiving me, I had been building the case that would dismantle his carefully constructed world of lies. And in that moment of revelation, when he realized that I had never been the oblivious, manipulable woman he had taken me for, I would finally see the truth, in his eyes. I returned to the living room window, watching as more vehicles quietly took position along our street. The teams would be thorough, professional, respectful of the fact that this was not just a crime scene but my home. They would search Daniel's office, his closet, the hidden compartment in the garage where he thought I didn't know he kept his second phone and private documents. They would find everything I had carefully cataloged over the months of living this double life of being both his wife and the agent gathering evidence against him. The woman on the phone, Vanessa, had said Daniel told her I was cold, ambitious, obsessed with my career. She had thrown these accusations at me as weapons, expecting them to wound. What she couldn't understand, what Daniel had never understood, was that these were not weaknesses, but strengths. My focus, my dedication, my unflinching commitment to truth had made me an excellent agent. And tonight, those same qualities would allow me to face my husband one last time, not as the betrayed wife, but as the architect of his downfall. I checked my watch again. 10 minutes until they would arrive with Daniel. 10 minutes until the final act of our marriage would play, out in this house we had shared. I moved to the bar cart and poured 2 fingers of Daniel's favorite scotch into his crystal tumbler. Not for him. He would not be offered refreshments during the search, but for myself. A small ceremony to mark the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. As I raised the glass, I caught sight of our wedding photo on the mantel. We had looked so young, so full of promise and possibility. I had loved him then, with the wholehearted certainty of a woman who believed she had found her partner in all things. To us, I whispered to the ghosts of who we had been, and to the I, truth, however painful it may be. I drained the glass, feeling the scotch burn a path down my throat, warming me from the inside in a way that nothing else had since this investigation began. Outside, car doors closed quietly. Footsteps approached the house. The doorbell rang, a commonplace sound that tonight heralded the collapse of the life I had known. I set down the empty tumbler, straightened my spine, and moved to answer the door. It was time to show Daniel exactly who he had underestimated. I opened the door to find Assistant Director Whitman on my doorstep, his imposing 6'4" frame filling the entrance. Behind him stood Agents Mercer and Chen, their expressions professionally neutral despite the unusual circumstances of arresting their colleague's husband. "Agent Donovan?" Whitman nodded, the formality a kindness, a reminder that I was first and foremost an agent of the Bureau, not merely a betrayed wife. "Sir," I stepped aside to let them enter. "I've secured the residence as requested." "Good. The transport vehicle with your husband will arrive momentarily. I wanted a word before they bring him in." Whitman moved into the foyer, his eyes briefly taking in the anniversary setup still visible in the dining room beyond. Something like sympathy flickered across his weathered face before his professional mask returned. "I need to confirm you're still comfortable with this arrangement," he said quietly. "No one would think less of you if you chose to be elsewhere during the search." I appreciated the consideration, but we both knew my presence was necessary, not just for the case, but for my own closure. "I'm exactly where I need to be, sir." Whitman held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. "The search team is 2 minutes out. They'll be thorough but respectful. I've prepared a floor plan indicating the locations of interest." I gestured to the documents on the side table. "Daniel's home office is upstairs, first door on the right. The hidden safe is behind the Winslow Homer print, combination 052264, his father's birthday. Secondary devices may be in the workshop in the basement." Mercer picked up the floor plan, studying it with professional interest. "Any weapons we should know about, Agent Donovan?" "A hunting rifle in the bedroom closet, registered and secured. A Glock 19 in his desk drawer, both listed in the warrant." The sound of another vehicle pulling up caught our attention. Through the window, I saw the government SUV that would be transporting Daniel. "You're certain about this?" Whitman asked, one final time. "Completely," I replied, though my heartbeat quickened as car doors slammed outside. Heavy footsteps on the walkway. The squeak of the garden gate. Then Daniel appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 agents, his hands cuffed in front of him. He wore the charcoal suit I'd watched him select this morning, planning, I now realized, for his evening with Vanessa, not the late meeting he'd claimed. The shock on his face when he saw me standing beside Whitman was everything I'd anticipated. And more? "Becky?" Confusion, then relief washed over his features. "Thank God. There's been a terrible mistake. Tell them who I am. Tell them—" His words died as his eyes fixed on the FBI badge visible at my hip. "Special Agent Rebecca Donovan, Financial Crimes Unit," Whitman said into the silence. "Your wife has been instrumental in building the case. Against you, Mr. Matthews." Daniel's face drained of color. "That's not— You can't—" His eyes locked with mine, disbelief warring with dawning horror. "Becky, what is this? What have you done?" "My job," I said simply. For 10 years, I'd been Rebecca Matthews in our personal life, carefully separating my professional identity. Even our closest friends knew only that I worked for the government in some unspecified capacity. Daniel had found my discretion about my work charming, never once suspecting that my compartmentalization served a purpose beyond national security protocols. "I don't understand," Daniel sputtered, looking wildly around the foyer as more agents entered, carrying equipment for the search. "Is this about the offshore account? I can explain that. It was a temporary measure, a business necessity. It's about the $19 million you've siphoned from client accounts over the past 3 years," I said evenly. "It's about the falsified investment reports, the shell companies, the forged signatures. It's about the elaborate Ponzi scheme you've been running, Daniel." He flinched as though I'd struck him. "You've been investigating me? For how long? Does it matter?" "Of course it matters." His voice rose, composure fracturing. "How much of our marriage has been real? Has any of it been real?" The question struck harder than I expected, piercing the professional armor I'd wrapped around myself. How much had been real? The early years, certainly, before the discrepancies appeared, before I'd taken my concerns to Whitman, before I'd been faced with the impossible choice between my vows and my oath to uphold the law. "I could ask you the same question," I replied, gesturing toward the search team now headed upstairs. "Was Vanessa the first, or just the most recent?" Daniel's expression shifted, calculation replacing shock. "So that's what this is about. You found out about Vanessa and decided to destroy me. Christ, Becky, an affair doesn't justify this level of retribution." Whitman stiffened beside me, but I raised a hand slightly. I needed this conversation. "The affair is between you and your conscience, Daniel. The federal charges are between you and the justice system. Don't conflate the two." "You're my wife," he hissed, leaning forward until one of the agents firmly gripped his shoulder, pulling him back. "You're supposed to stand by me, not lead the fucking charge against me." "And you were supposed to honor our vows," I countered, "including the part about obeying the law. Apparently, we've both experienced disappointment." Before he could respond, Agent Chen appeared at the top of the stairs. "Sir, we've found something you should see." Whitman nodded. "Agent Donovan, would you show the search team the access point for the basement storage area? I'll handle this." The request was both procedural and compassionate, giving me a reason to step away from the increasingly volatile confrontation with Daniel. I nodded gratefully and moved toward the kitchen, where 3 agents waited with evidence collection. "Kits, this way," I said, leading them to the pantry that concealed the entrance to Daniel's private workshop. As I pulled the hidden lever that swung the false wall open, revealing the staircase beyond, one of the younger agents, Rodriguez, according to his badge, gave me a sidelong glance. "Permission to speak freely, Agent Donovan?" I tensed, anticipating the personal question or expression of pity that would follow. "Granted. Your case notes on the financial patterns were the most thorough I've seen in 5 years with the Bureau. The asset tracing methodology you developed for this investigation is being implemented as a training model at Quantico." It was so far from what I expected that I stared at him for a moment before a genuine smile, the first in what felt like months, tugged at my lips. "Thank you, Agent Rodriguez. I only mention it because—" He hesitated, then continued carefully. "Because sometimes in these situations, personal involvement can overshadow professional accomplishment. Your work on this case was exceptional, regardless of the circumstances." His words provided an unexpected balm to my professional pride, which had taken its own battering during this investigation. Despite my best efforts to remain objective, there had been moments when I questioned whether my personal connection to Daniel had clouded my judgment, either making me see crimes where none existed, or, conversely, making me reluctant to pursue evidence as aggressively as I should. "I appreciate that," I said sincerely. As the agents descended into Daniel's workshop, I heard raised voices from upstairs, Daniel's protestations growing more desperate as the evidence against him was uncovered, room by room, illusion by illusion. I remained in the kitchen, giving the search team space to work, giving myself space to breathe. On the counter sat the anniversary gift I'd planned to give Daniel tonight. A first edition Hemingway I'd tracked down months ago, inscribed with a personal message about the journey we'd shared. The journey I'd believed we were sharing. A journey that had led us here, to federal agents dismantling our home in search of evidence, to Daniel in handcuffs in our foyer, to the complete unraveling of the life we'd built. From upstairs came the sound of drawers being opened, closets searched, items cataloged, the methodical dismantling of our marriage, one piece of evidence at a time. My secure phone buzzed, a text from Agent Mercer. Found hidden laptop behind bookcase in office, heavily encrypted, tech team en route. I wasn't surprised. Daniel had always been meticulous about security, a trait I'd once attributed to his financial profession, but now recognized as the caution of someone with much to hide. From the foyer, I heard Daniel's voice again, now pleading with Whitman. I need to speak with her, alone. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. I steeled myself, knowing Whitman would deny the request, but equally certain Daniel wouldn't stop asking. Sure enough, moments later, the assistant director appeared in the kitchen doorway. He's requesting a private conversation, Whitman said without preamble. Agency protocol would typically prohibit it, but given the unique circumstances. He left the sentence unfinished, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. In his 30 years with the Bureau, I doubted he'd ever overseen a case where an agent had helped build evidence against their own spouse. Do you think it would yield anything useful for the case? I asked, deliberately focusing on the professional rather than personal implications. Possibly. He seems desperate. Desperate people often say more than they intend. I considered it for a moment. From a strictly investigative standpoint, there was potential value in letting Daniel talk. From a personal standpoint, that was more complicated. 5 minutes, I agreed finally. In the living room with audio surveillance active. Whitman nodded. I'll have Chen and Mercer positioned in the dining room. If he becomes aggressive or attempts to intimidate you, I can handle Daniel, I interrupted, more sharply than intended. Then softening my tone, but I appreciate the precaution. Minutes later, I sat on the edge of the sofa while Daniel paced in front of the fireplace, his handcuffs removed, but his movements constrained by the agent positioned at the doorway. The living room, where we'd spent countless evenings reading, side by side where we'd celebrated holidays and entertained friends, now felt like an interrogation room. 5 minutes, Whitman reminded Daniel from the doorway. Agent Chen will remain within visual contact. Daniel waited until Whitman retreated to the dining room before turning to me, his expression a complex mixture of anger, fear, and something that might have been regret. How long have you known? He asked, his voice low and strained. Known what, specifically? About the financial crimes? The affairs? The lies you've been telling me since the day we met? He flinched. That's not fair. None of this is fair, Daniel. Not to your clients who trusted you with their life savings. Not to me. I never meant to hurt you. The platitude, so inadequate, so absurd in the face of what he'd done, nearly made me laugh. And yet, here we are. He raked a hand through his hair, disheveling the careful styling he'd doubtless perfected for Vanessa. The financial situation, it's complicated. I got in over my head. One compromised investment led to another, and suddenly I was moving, money around just to stay afloat. Save it for your defense attorney. I stood, ready to end this farce of a conversation, but Daniel stepped closer, his eyes pleading. Becky, please, we can still fix this. You have influence with the Bureau. If you tell them I was cooperating, if you say I was planning to turn myself in, were you? I was working toward making things right. By emptying our joint account last week, by planning to leave me tonight, on our anniversary, that kind of making things right? His expression confirmed what I already knew. Vanessa had been telling the truth about his plans to leave. "I see," I said quietly. "So this evening's raid actually interrupted your escape plan." Daniel's silence was damning. "Where were you planning to go?" "The Caymans, where the bulk of the laundered money is held. Or perhaps St. Barthélemy. You always did enjoy our trips there." His head snapped up. "You know about the Cayman accounts?" "We've frozen all of them," I confirmed, watching the last of his hope drain away. "The villa in St. Barth's has been seized as an asset purchased with client funds. The yacht, too." Daniel sank into the armchair, seemingly aged a decade in the past hour. "It's really over then?" "Yes." "And us? Was any of it real, Becky?" The question echoed my own thoughts from earlier, but coming from him, it sparked a flash of anger. "I made real vows. I built a real life with you. I loved a man I thought was real." I moved toward the door, then turned back. "It seems only one of us was living in reality, Daniel. And it wasn't you." Before he could respond, I signaled to Agent Chen that the conversation was finished. As I walked away, I heard Daniel call after me, his voice breaking. "I did love you, Becky. Whatever else I've done, whatever lies I've told, that was real." I paused at the doorway but didn't turn around. If that's true, it only makes this worse. The search of our home continued through the night with methodical precision. Teams of agents moved from room to room, photographing, cataloging, bagging. Evidence that would be used to dismantle the life Daniel and I had built. I watched it all with a strange detachment, as if observing someone else's tragedy unfolding in someone else's home. Daniel had been taken back to the federal building downtown for processing. Tomorrow would bring the arraignment, the formal charges, the media coverage that would transform our private catastrophe into public spectacle. The well-respected investment manager, Daniel Matthews, charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and securities violations. The clients, who had trusted him with their futures, would learn how thoroughly that trust had been betrayed. And inevitably, there would be questions about me. How much had I known? When had I discovered the truth? Had I participated in or benefited from any of the illicit gains? The Bureau had prepared for this, of course. A statement had been drafted, explaining my role in uncovering the fraud, emphasizing my immediate reporting of suspicions and complete cooperation with the investigation. My own financial records had been exhaustively reviewed to confirm I had no involvement in or knowledge of Daniel's schemes before I reported them. Still, mud sticks. I knew that better than most, having spent my career watching how public opinion could taint even the most unimpeachable evidence. "Agent Donovan?" Whitman appeared in the doorway of the guest bedroom where I'd retreated. "Tech team's finished with the primary search. They've secured 3 laptops, multiple external drives, and several phones. Initial assessment suggests the encryption is substantial, but not insurmountable." I nodded, unsurprised. Daniel always was meticulous about security. Used to joke that he was better protected than Fort Knox. The irony wasn't lost on me now. All that security to protect his criminal enterprise rather than client assets. "There's something else." Whitman's expression was carefully neutral. "We found documentation regarding a property in Vermont, purchased 6 months ago under an LLC not connected to any of his known shells. Does that align with anything you're aware of?" Vermont. My mind flickered immediately to our early courtship, a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast in Stowe, where Daniel had first told me he loved me among the brilliant autumn foliage. He'd often spoken of retiring there someday, somewhere peaceful away from Boston's constant motion. "No," I said quietly. "I had no knowledge of any Vermont property." Whitman studied me for a moment, then nodded. "We'll investigate further. The address is linked to substantial cash withdrawals over recent months. Could be a bolt hole he was preparing." The implication was clear. Daniel had been planning his exit strategy for longer than I'd realized. The Vermont property, the cash stockpile, the offshore accounts. While I'd been planning our anniversary dinner, he'd been constructing his escape route. "Sir," Agent Rodriguez appeared behind Whitman. "We've located a safe deposit box key hidden in a false bottom of the master bathroom cabinet. Records indicate it's at First Commonwealth Bank downtown." "Get a warrant for the box," Whitman instructed. "First thing tomorrow." As they discussed logistics, I moved to the window, looking out at our carefully landscaped backyard. The Japanese maple we'd planted on our 5th anniversary, the stone path leading to the small meditation garden I'd designed during a particularly stressful case 3 years ago. Every corner of this property held memories, moments I'd believed we were building together toward a shared future. Had any of it been real for Daniel? Or had our entire marriage been an elaborate cover for his financial schemes, a respectable facade behind which he could operate with impunity? The question haunted me as the search teams gradually completed their work and departed, leaving behind a home that no longer felt like mine. Rooms stripped of Daniel's personal items, drawers emptied of documents, walls bare where artwork had been removed for evidence evaluation. By 3 a.m., only Whitman remained, overseeing the final security checks before officially releasing the scene. "We can arrange a security detail if you're concerned about press showing up," he offered as he prepared to leave. "This will hit the news cycle by morning." "Thank you, but no," I declined. "I've faced hostile situations before." "Not like this," Whitman said quietly. "Not personal like this." His concern was touching, but I'd already made my decision. "I won't hide, sir. I've done nothing wrong." Whitman nodded, respecting my choice if not agreeing with it. "The Bureau stands behind you, Donovan. Whatever comes next." After he left, I moved through the silent house, observing the aftermath of the search, the subtle disarray, the absence of items that had been fixtures in our daily lives. In the master bedroom, Daniel's closet stood half empty, his favorite suits and shoes now evidence in the case against him. His nightstand drawer gaped open, emptied of the watch collection he'd so proudly displayed to guests. I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for a decade, allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had happened, what was still to come. The numbness that had carried me through the evening began to recede, replaced by waves of emotion I'd kept carefully contained while agents were present. Anger came first, hot and clarifying. Anger at Daniel's betrayal, at the calculated deception that had defined our marriage, at the clients whose financial futures he had casually destroyed in service to his greed, at Vanessa, who had gleefully called to twist the knife on my anniversary, unaware she was merely accelerating the inevitable. But beneath the anger lay something deeper and more painful. Grief for the life I had believed was mine. For the husband I had trusted implicitly. For the future we had planned together, now irrevocably shattered. I moved to the master bathroom, avoiding my reflection in the mirror as I washed my face, removing the carefully applied makeup I'd selected for our anniversary celebration. The woman who had prepared for that dinner, hopeful despite growing suspicions, determined to give Daniel one last chance to come clean, seemed a stranger to me now. Back in the bedroom, I changed out of my dress and into comfortable clothes, knowing sleep would be impossible. Instead, I descended to the kitchen and put on water for tea, seeking some small normalcy in the ritual. As the kettle heated, my phone buzzed with a text message. I expected Whitman with an update, or perhaps one of my colleagues offering support. Instead, I found a message from an unknown number. "They took him. I need to talk to you. What do you know about the Liechtenstein accounts? Vanessa." I stared at the message, piecing together the implications. Daniel hadn't told her everything, it seemed. She didn't know about the impending investigation or my role in it. And now she was reaching out, seeking information, or perhaps offering it. I showed the message to Whitman first thing the following morning, when he arrived to escort me to the federal building for my formal statement. "Interesting," he mused, studying the text. "She could be valuable if she has information Daniel hasn't shared with us." Or she could be attempting to extract information about our case, I countered. Daniel may have instructed her to reach out. Either way, worth pursuing. Whitman handed the phone to a tech specialist who had accompanied him. Set up a secure line for Agent Donovan to respond. We'll want full monitoring. I nodded in agreement, though something about Vanessa's message nagged at me. The Liechtenstein accounts weren't mentioned in any of the evidence I'd seen. If Daniel had additional hidden assets beyond what we'd uncovered. Sir, may I review the financial documentation again before my statement? I want to ensure I haven't missed anything relevant. Whitman agreed, and for the next 2 hours, I immersed myself in the paper trail of Daniel's deception. Bank statements, transfer records, client account documentation. The more I examined, the more I recognized how skillfully he had covered his tracks, using a labyrinth of shell companies and intermediaries to obscure the movement of funds. Had I not been trained in exactly this type of financial forensics, I might never have noticed the initial discrepancies that led me to report my concerns. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel had chosen to marry a woman whose professional expertise was in detecting exactly the kind of fraud he was perpetrating. Had he thought my love for him would blind me to the evidence? Or had he simply believed himself too clever to be caught, even by a specialist in financial crimes? As I prepared for my formal statement, a text arrived from the secure line established for communication with Vanessa. Meeting at the Paramount Hotel, room 412, 4 p.m. Come alone if you want to know the truth about Daniel. And bring the key from his mahogany box. I showed the message to Whitman immediately. What key is she referring to? Unknown, he replied. But the search team cataloged a mahogany jewelry box in your bedroom closet. Nothing of evidential value was noted. I frowned, trying to recall the box. It was a gift from his mother when he graduated business school. He keeps cufflinks and collar stays in it. Worth checking, Whitman decided. If there's a key we missed, it could be significant. An agent was dispatched to retrieve the box while I completed my statement. A comprehensive account of when I first noticed financial irregularities, how I brought them to the Bureau's attention, and the steps taken to maintain operational security during the investigation. Throughout the process, I maintained my professional composure, reciting dates and details with clinical precision. Only when asked about the initial discovery, the moment I realized my husband might be involved in serious financial crimes, did my voice falter slightly. I was reconciling our personal accounts, I explained. Daniel had always handled our finances, but I noticed unusual transfers from our joint savings to an account I didn't recognize. When I asked him about it, his explanation didn't align with the transaction records. That discrepancy led me to look deeper. What I didn't articulate was the sick feeling that had accompanied that discovery, the sleepless nights that followed. As I debated whether to pursue my suspicions or accept Daniel's explanations, the moment I realized that my professional oath and my marriage vows were on a collision course. By the time I completed my statement, the agent had returned with Daniel's mahogany box. Under Whitman's supervision, I carefully examined it, the familiar wood grain, the brass hinges, the monogrammed lid. Inside, as expected, were Daniel's cufflinks, tie clips, and collar stays, arranged neatly in velvet-lined compartments. Nothing unusual, I confirmed, about to close the lid when something caught my eye. A slight variation in the depth of the box compared to the height of its sides. Years of searching for hidden compartments in financial investigations triggered my instincts. I pressed carefully around the edges of the velvet lining until I felt a subtle give in one corner. Working slowly, I lifted the entire tray of jewelry items, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside lay a single key, small, brass, antique in appearance, alongside a folded piece of paper. I carefully unfolded the note, written in Daniel's distinctive hand, for safekeeping, Vermont property deed and deposit box. Whitman examined the key and note carefully. This aligns with the Vermont property we discovered. The key likely opens the safe deposit box Rodriguez found evidence of. I nodded, trying to process the implications. Daniel had hidden the key and note in a place only I was likely to find, not in his office or personal belongings where business. Associates might discover it, but in a family heirloom kept in our shared bedroom. He wanted me to find this, I said slowly. Or at least, he wanted someone close to him to find it if something happened to him. Or it's another layer of misdirection, Whitman countered. Either way, we'll secure the contents of the safe deposit box. And regarding Vanessa's meeting request, I want to go, I said immediately. If she has information about additional accounts or assets, out of the question, Whitman interrupted firmly. We'll send an undercover agent. You're too personally involved, Donovan. With all due respect, sir, that personal involvement is precisely why I should go. Vanessa will be looking for Daniel's wife, not a federal agent. She'll be more likely to reveal what she knows if she believes she's manipulating me. Whitman considered this, clearly torn between operational advantage and concern for my well-being. You'd be wired, with a tactical team nearby. No exceptions. Agreed. And you'll extract whatever information she has without revealing details. Of our investigation? Of course. I hesitated, then added, There's another consideration, sir. If Vanessa was involved in Daniel's schemes, even unwittingly, she could be facing charges herself. That might make her more willing to cooperate. Whitman nodded slowly. We'll prepare a limited immunity agreement, contingent on full cooperation and verification of the information she provides. As arrangements were made for the meeting, I found myself in the unsettling position of preparing to confront my husband's mistress, not as a betrayed wife, but as a federal agent seeking evidence. The personal and professional had become so entangled that I could no longer separate my anger at Vanessa for her role in Daniel's deception from my determination to uncover the full extent of his crimes. Remember, Whitman cautioned as technicians fitted me with a concealed microphone, the priority is information gathering. Whatever personal feelings you have toward this woman need to be contained. I understand, sir. And Donovan, he added, his expression softening slightly. Be careful. People trapped in corners can be unpredictable. As I prepared to leave for the Paramount Hotel, I wondered which of us was truly in the corner. Vanessa, suddenly cut off from Daniel and potentially implicated in his crimes? Or me, navigating the ruins of my marriage while trying to maintain my professional integrity? Perhaps, I reflected grimly, we were both trapped in prisons of Daniel's making. Different cells, but the same architect. The Paramount Hotel stood in Boston's Theater District, an Art Deco building that had once been glamorous but now wore its faded elegance like an aging actress clinging to former glory. It wasn't Daniel's usual style. He preferred modern luxury with attentive service and name recognition. That he'd connected Vanessa to this place suggested either financial constraints I hadn't anticipated or a deliberate attempt to stay beneath notice. I approached room 412 at precisely 4 p.m., the key from Daniel's box tucked in my pocket. A wire, transmitting every sound to the tactical team positioned throughout the hotel. Agent Mercer was posing as a housekeeper at the end of the hallway, while Chen had stationed himself in the lobby. Whitman supervised from a surveillance van parked across the street. The protocol was clear. Extract information about the Liechtenstein accounts, determine Vanessa's level of involvement, and assess whether she could be flipped as a witness against Daniel. My personal feelings were irrelevant to the operation. I knocked 3 times, steadying myself for the confrontation. The woman who opened the door was not what I expected. From Daniel's known preferences and the glimpses I'd caught during surveillance, I'd anticipated someone polished and conventionally attractive, a younger, less complicated version of myself. Instead, Vanessa appeared exhausted, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater rather than the sleek cocktail dress she'd likely planned for her anniversary dinner with my husband. "You came," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would." You said you had information about Daniel, I replied neutrally. I'm listening. She stepped back to let me enter the modest hotel room, which showed signs of hasty occupation: an open suitcase spilling clothes onto the bed, takeout containers. On the desk, a laptop surrounded by scattered papers. Did you bring the key? She asked immediately, scanning me with wary eyes. I reached into my pocket and produced it, holding it up but not offering it to her. First, tell me about the Liechtenstein accounts. Vanessa gestured for me to sit in one of the room's 2 chairs, while she perched on the edge of the bed. Up close, I could see she was younger than I'd initially thought. Early 30s, perhaps, with the kind of natural beauty that needed little enhancement. I don't know the details, she admitted. Only that Daniel mentioned Liechtenstein as his insurance policy if things went wrong with his primary operation. He said the accounts there were untraceable, set up through a law firm that specializes in that sort of thing. And what exactly is that sort of thing? I kept my tone conversational, professional. Asset protection, he called it. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. I figured it was standard practice for someone in his position, with his net worth. It wasn't until last night when the FBI showed up that I realized. She trailed off, looking away. That you were involved with? A criminal? I supplied, unable to keep a slight edge from my voice. Her eyes snapped back to mine. I didn't know. Whatever you think of me, and I can guess what that is, I didn't know he was stealing. He told me he was a successful investment manager with wealthy private clients. That much seemed obvious from his lifestyle, his connections. And what did he tell you about me? I asked, watching her face carefully for signs of deception. Vanessa hesitated, clearly calculating how honest to be. He said you were distant, consumed by your government job, that you two had grown apart years ago, but stayed together out of convenience. She offered a bitter smile. He claimed you had an arrangement, that you both discreetly saw other people. I know now that was a lie. The familiar script of the unfaithful spouse, casting their partner as cold, unavailable, complicit in the infidelity through some unspoken agreement. I'd heard it countless times in other investigations, but experiencing it personally sent a fresh wave of anger through me. When did your relationship with Daniel begin? I kept my voice even, focused on information gathering rather than the betrayal. 14 months ago. I was working as a financial analyst at Meridian Partners when Daniel came in as a consultant. She pushed hair back from her face, a nervous gesture. He was charming, attentive, made me feel valued professionally before it became personal. The timeline aligned with when Daniel's financial schemes had expanded significantly, right when he would have needed someone with insider access to Meridian Partners, one of Boston's most prestigious investment firms. And when did he start? Asking you for information about Meridian's clients? Her head snapped up, eyes widening. How did you? She stopped, reassessing me. You're not just his wife, are you? The FBI agents last night, they seemed to know you. I considered my options, weighing operational security against the potential value of her cooperation. Whitman had authorized limited disclosure if necessary to secure her assistance. I'm a federal agent, I confirmed. Financial Crimes Unit. The color drained from her face. Oh my God, he married an FBI agent while running a Ponzi scheme? Was he insane? That's one theory, I replied dryly. Now, about Meridian Partners, what information did Daniel ask you to provide? Vanessa stood abruptly, pacing the small room. This makes so much sense now. Why he was so secretive about certain aspects of his business. Why he kept the Liechtenstein account separate from everything else. She turned to face me. You've been investigating him. That's why you knew about me, about his plans to leave tonight. Answer the question, Vanessa. What information did you give him? She sank back onto the bed, defeat evident in her posture. Client portfolios, investment strategies, due diligence reports on potential acquisitions. He said he needed them to ensure his own clients' investments were properly aligned with market movements. She laughed hollowly. I believed him. I thought I was helping his legitimate business. And the Vermont property? I produced the note found with the key. What do you know about that? Surprise flickered across her face. Vermont? No, the key is for a safe deposit box at International Trust Bank. It contains documents about the Liechtenstein accounts, access codes, the law firm's contact information, everything needed to access the funds. Now it was my turn to be surprised. The key I'd found wasn't for the safe deposit box at First Commonwealth that Rodriguez had discovered, but for an entirely different box at a different bank, one that hadn't appeared in any of our financial traces. When did Daniel give you this information about the key? He didn't give it to me exactly, Vanessa admitted. I overheard him on the phone with someone, a lawyer, I think. He mentioned that everything needed for the Liechtenstein recovery was in a safe deposit box at International Trust, accessible with a key hidden where only family would look. After the FBI arrested him, I remembered that conversation and called you. I weighed her story against what we knew. If she was telling the truth, Daniel had hidden assets beyond what our investigation had uncovered, potentially millions that could be used for restitution to his victims. Why tell me this? I asked, directly. Why not keep this information to yourself? Vanessa met my eyes squarely for the first time. Because I'm scared. The FBI took my laptop, my phone. They questioned me for hours about what I knew of Daniel's business. I need to demonstrate cooperation if I want to avoid charges myself. She leaned forward. And because as much as you probably hate me, I didn't know I was helping him steal from people. I didn't know he was lying to you, to me, to everyone. There was a desperation in her voice that rang true. The panic of someone suddenly realizing they'd been maneuvered into complicity with crimes they hadn't fully understood. If the information you've provided proves accurate, it will be taken into consideration, I said, falling back on formal language as I processed the implications. I'll need everything you know about these Liechtenstein accounts, any account numbers, bank names, contacts. I don't have specifics, she said, just what I overheard. But I do know the name of the law firm, Neumann and Kraft in Vaduz. Daniel mentioned them several times. I nodded, making mental note for Whitman. And your relationship with Daniel? You said he planned to leave me tonight? Vanessa had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's what he promised. He said he'd tell you after your anniversary dinner, that he'd already consulted a divorce attorney. She twisted her hands in her lap. I believed him, but there were always reasons why the timing wasn't right. Looking back, I think he was stringing me along, just like he was stringing along his investors. The tactical assessment was clear. Vanessa was offering valuable information, appeared genuinely unaware of the full extent of Daniel's crimes, and was motivated by self-preservation to cooperate. The personal assessment was more complicated. This woman had participated in the destruction of my marriage. However, unwittingly, she may have been drawn into Daniel's larger schemes. I'll need a formal statement, I said, standing to indicate the conversation was concluding. And full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Of course, she agreed quickly. Whatever you need. As I turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice smaller. For what it's worth, and I know it's worth very little to you, I'm sorry. Not just for my role in all this, but for that call last night. It was cruel, and I regret it. I paused at the door, considering how to respond. The professional in me acknowledged a potentially cooperative witness. The wounded wife wanted to lash out, to make her feel a fraction of the pain I'd experienced. In the end, I chose neither. We were both deceived by Daniel, just in different ways. The difference is, I was doing my job when I uncovered the truth. You were actively helping him violate the law. Her face crumpled slightly at the coldness in my tone, but she nodded, accepting the rebuke. I left without looking back, signaling Mercer as I exited. Within minutes, he would escort Vanessa to a waiting vehicle for formal questioning at the federal building. Outside in the surveillance van, Whitman reviewed my conversation with approval. "Good work, Donovan. The information about International Trust Bank and the Liechtenstein connection is significant. We'll secure a warrant for the safe deposit box immediately." "She seems willing to cooperate," I noted, removing the wire as a technician assisted. I believe her claim that she didn't understand the full extent of Daniel's operation. "We'll offer limited immunity in exchange for her testimony," Whitman agreed. Her insider access at Meridian Partners could be crucial to understanding how Daniel identified his victims and manipulated their portfolios. As we drove back to the federal building, I found myself reflecting on the parallel deceptions Daniel had maintained. The financial fraud he perpetrated on his clients, and the personal fraud he'd perpetrated on both Vanessa and me. Different. Lies tailored to different audiences, all serving the same purpose: to enrich himself at others' expense. The next morning brought confirmation that Vanessa's information was legitimate. The safe deposit box at International Trust Bank contained exactly what she'd described: documentation for accounts at Liechtensteinische Landesbank holding approximately $4.3 million, as well as ownership papers for a villa in the south of France that hadn't appeared in any of our previous asset traces. "He was more thorough than we thought," Whitman commented as we reviewed the new evidence. "These accounts were established 3 years ago, before we began monitoring his activities. The discovery led to a new round of international financial traces, cooperation requests with foreign authorities, and asset freezes that would likely take months to fully resolve. But the additional funds, once recovered, would provide at least partial restitution to Daniel's victims, many of whom were facing financial ruin from his betrayal. Daniel himself remained in federal custody, denied bail due to flight risk. His legal team had already approached the U.S. Attorney's Office seeking a plea agreement, but with the new evidence continuing to emerge, the prosecutors were in no hurry to make a deal. I maintained my professional distance from these negotiations, formally recused from any decision-making role in the case, while continuing to provide necessary testimony and evidence. But as the investigation expanded, revealing the true scope of Daniel's deception, I found myself struggling with a question that had no clear answer. How had I lived with this man for 10 years without recognizing what he truly was? One week, after Daniel's arrest, I stood in our bedroom, my bedroom now, sorting through his remaining possessions. The FBI had taken what they needed for evidence, but the rest remained. Designer suits hanging in perfect alignment, Italian, leather shoes arrayed by color, monogrammed shirts still starched and pressed. The material trappings of a successful life now revealed as props in an elaborate performance. The media coverage had been as brutal as expected. FBI agent arrests fraudster husband made headlines nationwide, with financial publications diving deeper into the mechanics of Daniel's scheme while tabloids fixated on the personal betrayal. My colleagues had formed a protective barrier around me at the federal building, deflecting reporters and curiosity seekers, but I couldn't hide forever, nor did I want to. I refused to behave as though I had something to be ashamed of. I pulled another suit from the closet, charcoal gray Tom Ford that Daniel had worn to last year's charity gala, and added it to the donation pile. Keeping his clothes felt wrong, selling them felt tasteless, so local shelters would benefit from his extensive wardrobe, a small reclamation of something positive from this mess. My secure phone rang, Whitman's direct line. "Sir? Donovan, are you sitting down?" Something in his voice immediately put me on alert. "What's happened?" "We've identified the Vermont property from the documentation in the safe deposit box. It's registered to an LLC called Sunfish Holdings, which links back to a trust benefiting someone named Michael Gregory Matthews." I frowned, trying to place the name. "Not familiar. A cousin of Daniel's, perhaps?" Doe B is listed as March 17th, 2019. The date hit me like a physical blow. A child, born 3 years ago. That's not possible, I said automatically, though even as the words left my mouth, I was mentally calculating, remembering. 3 years ago, Daniel had taken an extended business trip to Chicago. 2 weeks away, with spotty communication he'd blamed on intensive client meetings. The mother is listed as Elaine Gregory, resident of Burlington, Vermont. Property records show she's been living at the address since January 2019, with all expenses paid by the trust. I sank onto the edge of the bed, mind racing to absorb this new betrayal. Not just an affair, not just financial fraud, but a child. A secret family maintained in parallel to our life together. DNA confirmation? I managed to ask. Professional training taking over when emotional processing failed. Not yet, but financial records show regular transfers from Daniel's hidden accounts to Ms. Gregory dating back to late 2018. Photos recovered from a cloud account linked to Daniel's secondary email show him with both the woman and child as recently as 2 months ago. 2 months ago. While I was leading a multi-agency task force on securities fraud, Daniel had been visiting his secret family in Vermont. While I was working late, believing my husband was doing the same, he had been maintaining an entirely separate life. I thought you should hear this from me, Whitman continued gently, before it appears in a case report. I'm sorry, Donovan. Thank you for the courtesy, I replied automatically, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Will this affect the case progression? It's another jurisdiction for financial fraud, potentially more victims. I've assigned Chen to liaise with the Vermont field office. After ending the call, I sat motionless, staring at the half-empty closet. The shock was evolving into something else. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but a profound sense of having been not just betrayed but erased. The life I thought I'd been living, the marriage I'd believed in despite growing evidence of financial impropriety, had been an elaborate fiction. Daniel hadn't just lied about money. He'd lied about the fundamental structure of his life, about his very identity as my husband. I moved to my laptop and did what I'd resisted doing since Daniel's arrest. I searched his name online, looking not at news reports of his crimes, but at social media, at digital breadcrumbs that might have revealed the truth sooner had I thought to look. Daniel had always been minimally present online, a carefully maintained LinkedIn profile for professional purposes, but no personal social media that I was aware of. I'd respected this as a privacy choice, perhaps even appreciated it as aligned with my own security-conscious approach to digital life. Now I recognized it as calculated compartmentalization. It didn't take long to find Elaine Gregory once I knew to look. A photographer with a professional Instagram showcasing Vermont landscapes and family portraits. Her personal account was private, but her profile picture showed a striking woman with auburn hair holding a camera, backdropped by autumn foliage. I didn't request to follow her. I didn't need more details about the parallel life Daniel had constructed. The existence of this woman and her child, Daniel's child, was devastating enough without seeing their happy moments documented in filtered squares. Instead, I returned to the task of clearing out Daniel's possessions, now with renewed purpose. Every tie, every cufflink, every monogrammed handkerchief represented another facet of the lie I'd been living. Removing them from my home was a physical unburdening, a necessary excision of the cancer that had been growing undetected in my life. Worked methodically through the afternoon, sorting, boxing, occasionally pausing when a particular item triggered a memory too powerful to simply push aside. The watch I'd given him on our 5th anniversary, the vintage Yale sweatshirt he wore on Sunday mornings, the leather travel kit that had accompanied him on countless trips. Trips that now took on new meaning, new possibilities for deception. Had every business trip included a detour to Vermont? Had every late night at the office been spent in another woman's company? How many lies had I accepted without question, attributing my occasional unease to the natural distance that can develop in any long-term relationship? By evening, the physical purge was complete. Boxes for donation, bags for disposal, a small, Selection of items set aside that might have evidentiary value for the ongoing investigation. I stood in the center of the bedroom, surveying the newly empty spaces. The closet now held only my clothes, the dresser only my belongings. The room felt both liberating and unsettling in its half-emptiness. My doorbell rang, breaking the silence that had enveloped the house for hours. Through the security system, I saw Diane Harrington on my doorstep, my closest friend at the bureau, and the only colleague I'd allowed past the professional support into something more personal during this ordeal. I let her in, recognizing from her expression that she already knew about the Vermont situation. "Whitman told you," I said, not a question. Diane nodded, setting down the takeout bags she'd brought. "I volunteered to be the one to follow up with you, though I brought reinforcements." She produced a bottle of expensive bourbon from her tote. "Becca, figured if ever there was a time for the good stuff, it's now." I managed a weak smile, genuinely grateful for her presence. "Glasses are in the cabinet. I'll get plates." As we set up the impromptu dinner in my kitchen, Diane moved with the careful consideration of someone in a house of grief, which, in a way, was accurate. I was grieving the death of my marriage, my understanding of my own life, and the future I had planned. "Have you spoken with your family?" she asked as we settled at the kitchen island with our bourbon and Thai food. "Not about this latest development," I admitted. "They know about the arrest, the financial crimes. My father offered to fly up from Florida, but I asked him to wait." I took a sip of bourbon, letting it burn a clean path down my throat. "I'm not ready for the in-person sympathy yet." Diane nodded, understanding. As a fellow agent, she recognized the need to process, to establish control over one's narrative before facing well-meaning outsiders. "What about defense counsel?" she asked, switching to professional matters that might be easier to discuss. "Any movement on plea negotiations?" "Not that I've been informed of," I replied, grateful for the shift. "With the Liechtenstein accounts, and now this Vermont situation expanding the case, I imagine the prosecutors are reevaluating their position." "Daniel's got to know he's looking at serious time," Diane commented. "Multiple jurisdictions, clear evidence of intent, high value, fraud. Even with the best attorneys, he's facing years, not months." The thought of Daniel in prison produced a complex emotional response I wasn't yet ready to examine. Despite everything, the financial crimes, the affairs, the secret child, part of me still struggled to reconcile the man I'd married with the fee, criminal now facing federal charges. "What bothers me most," I found myself saying, "isn't even the betrayal itself. It's that I didn't see it. I'm trained to detect exactly these kinds of deceptions, to notice inconsistencies, to question convenient explanations. How did I miss what was happening in my own marriage?" Diane considered this, taking a thoughtful sip of her drink. "Because you weren't investigating your husband. You were loving him. Those require fundamentally different mindsets. But the signs were there. The unexplained absences, the financial discrepancies, which you did eventually notice," she pointed out. "And when you did, you acted appropriately. You reported your concerns, participated in the investigation, maintained operational security even at great personal cost." Her expression softened. "You did everything right, Rebecca. The fact that Daniel was able to deceive you doesn't reflect on your professional capabilities or your personal judgment. It reflects on his exceptional skill as a liar." I wanted to believe her, but the professional humiliation of having been so thoroughly duped still stung. I had built my career on seeing through financial fictions, on tracking the movement of money through increasingly complex schemes designed to obscure its origins and destinations. Yet in my personal life, I had failed to apply the same rigorous scrutiny. "I keep thinking about that woman in Vermont," I said quietly. "Elaine. Did she know about me? Was she another victim of Daniel's lies, or was she a willing participant?" "The Vermont team will determine that," Diane assured me. If she was aware of Daniel's married status or his financial crimes, she'll face appropriate consequences. But that wasn't really what bothered me about Elaine Gregory. What haunted me was the possibility that she had received a version of Daniel that I hadn't. A man present for his child's birth, for first steps and first words. A man who created a trust fund and purchased a home for his second family while systematically defrauding clients and lying to his wife. Had Daniel compartmentalized his life so completely that he was, effectively, different people in different settings? Or had one version been real and the other's performances? And if so, which was the authentic Daniel Matthews? These questions, I suspected, would never be fully answered. Not by the investigation, not by Daniel's eventual testimony, not by whatever details emerged about his life in Vermont. Some truths remain elusive even when the facts are fully documented. Diane stayed until nearly midnight, our conversation shifting between case details, bureau gossip, and occasional bursts of gallows humor that only law enforcement professionals truly understand. Her presence was a reminder that while my marriage had been built on sand, my professional relationships remained solid ground. After she left, I found myself once again in the bedroom, now eerily half-empty with Daniel's possessions removed. On impulse, I stripped the bed completely. Sheets, pillowcases, the duvet cover we'd selected together years ago, bundling everything into a laundry bag. Tomorrow I would purchase new bedding, something I alone had chosen. A small reclamation of space, of autonomy, of the life that was now solely mine to define. 2 weeks after the Vermont revelation, I found myself in a small conference room at the federal building, facing Daniel for the first time since his arrest. His attorneys had requested a meeting, claiming their client had information valuable to the ongoing investigation. Information he would share only with me. Whitman had opposed the arrangement initially, concerned about both the professional, ethics, and my personal well-being. But after consulting with the U.S. Attorney's Office, he'd reluctantly agreed, with strict parameters. The meeting would be recorded, additional agents would be present, and Daniel's legal team would be limited to one attorney in the room. "You don't have to do this," Whitman reminded me as we waited for Daniel to be brought in. "We can still cancel if you're uncomfortable." "I'm fine, sir," I replied, arranging my notepad and pen with careful precision. "If he has information that can help recover additional assets for his victims, I want to hear it." The truth was more complicated. Part of me needed to see Daniel, to look into the eyes of the man who had shared my bed, my home, my life, and recognize him for what he truly was. Not the devoted husband I had believed in, not even the financial criminal I had investigated, but something more complex. A man capable of creating and maintaining multiple separate realities simultaneously. The door opened and Daniel entered, flanked by a U.S. Marshal and followed by his attorney, Patricia Winters, one of Boston's most formidable defense lawyers, known for handling high-profile white-collar cases. My first thought was how diminished he appeared. Just 17 days in federal custody had transformed the polished investment manager into someone smaller, grayer, his bespoke suit replaced by standard-issue detainee khakis. His confident posture collapsed into a guarded hunch. His eyes found mine immediately, searching for something, recognition perhaps, or the emotional connection that had once existed between us. I kept my expression neutral, professional, revealing nothing of the turmoil his presence ignited. "You have 30 minutes, the marshal informed us before taking position by the door. Winters placed a leather portfolio on the table. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Agent Donovan. My client has information regarding additional accounts and assets not yet identified by the investigation, which he's prepared to disclose in exchange for consideration in charging and sentencing." I nodded. All business. "We're listening." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Rebecca." "Agent Donovan," I corrected, my tone clipped. A flash of hurt crossed his face before he composed himself. Agent Donovan, there are accounts in Singapore and Malta that haven't been located by your team. Approximately 11 million in total. I'm prepared to provide access information and assist in recovery. I made a note, though recording equipment was capturing every word. When were these accounts established? The Singapore account 5 years ago. Malta more recently, about 18 months. 5 years ago. When our marriage had still felt solid, when I had still believed in the life we were building together. I absorbed this new time frame for his deception, adding it to the growing chronology of betrayal. Why bring this forward now? I asked. You've maintained innocence through your arraignment. Winters interjected smoothly. My client recognizes the strength of the government's case and wishes to demonstrate good faith cooperation. I'm asking your client, I said, not looking away from Daniel. He held my gaze, and for a moment I glimpsed the man I thought I'd married. Direct, thoughtful, present. Because I owe at least this much truth to my clients. To you. You owe considerably more than financial disclosures, I replied evenly. But let's start there. What else haven't we found? For the next 20 minutes, Daniel outlined additional hidden assets. Properties held through shell companies in Costa Rica and Portugal. Investment accounts under associate names. Cryptocurrency holdings spread across multiple digital wallets. With each revelation, the magnitude of his financial deception expanded, as did the timeline of his careful planning. Throughout his recitation, I maintained my professional demeanor, asking clarifying questions, documenting access methods, probing for inconsistencies. The other agents in the room occasionally interjected with technical questions about transfer mechanisms or documentation, but mostly they let me lead the interview. It was only when the marshal indicated we had 5 minutes remaining that Daniel's composure finally cracked. Rebecca, he said, ignoring my earlier correction, I know you think you understand what happened, but you don't. There are things I need to explain. About us, about Elaine, about everything. I looked up from my notes, studying him coolly. This meeting is about financial disclosures relevant to your case, Mr. Matthews. Your personal explanations aren't pertinent to that purpose. They are to me, he insisted, leaning forward despite Winter's cautionary hand on his arm. You were my wife for 10 years. You deserve to know the truth. Which version? I asked, unable to completely suppress the bitterness that seeped into my voice. The truth you told me. The truth you told Vanessa. Or the truth you told Elaine. Gregory and your son in Vermont. Daniel flinched as if I'd struck him. You know about Michael. The Bureau is very thorough, Daniel. More thorough than I was, apparently, during our marriage. Winters intervened, clearly sensing the conversation veering into dangerous territory. My client is prepared to provide a complete accounting of all financial matters. Personal history can be addressed separately if relevant to the case. But Daniel wasn't looking at his attorney. His eyes remained fixed on me, pleading for something I wouldn't give him. I never meant to hurt you, he said quietly. That part was real. Us, in the beginning. It was real. The familiar refrain of unfaithful partners everywhere, claiming authenticity for the good moments while dismissing the deception that followed as somehow separate, less significant. As if relationships existed in convenient compartments rather, than as continuous narratives of choice and consequence. Time's up, the marshal announced, moving toward Daniel. As they prepared to escort him out, Daniel made one last attempt. The cabin in Maine. The information is there, in the place we talked about. Remember the first weekend? The promise we made? It's there, Beck. Everything you need to understand. Winters looked confused by this cryptic message, but I understood immediately. During our first weekend trip together, to a lakeside cabin in Maine, we'd discovered a hidden compartment beneath a window seat. A promise box, Daniel had called it. We'd written notes to each other and sealed them inside, pledging to return on our 10th anniversary to read them, an anniversary that had been interrupted by his arrest and the unraveling of our life together. After Daniel was led away, Whitman approached from the observation room where he'd been monitoring the interview. "Good work, Donovan. The information on Singapore and Malta aligns with some traces we've been developing. If it checks out, it's significant for the asset recovery effort." I nodded, gathering my notes with methodical precision, using the familiar motion to ground myself after the emotional turbulence of seeing Daniel. "That last bit about Maine," Whitman continued. "Any idea what he was referring to?" I hesitated, weighing professional obligation against personal boundaries. "A property we visited early in our relationship. There may be documents hidden there. Worth checking out? Potentially." I didn't elaborate on the emotional significance of the location, the private promises now rendered meaningless by Daniel's systematic betrayals. Whitman studied me carefully. "You handled that well. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I admitted, "but it was necessary." What I didn't say, what I could barely acknowledge to myself, was how seeing Daniel had affected me. Not because I still harbored feelings for him, but because sitting across from him, I'd realized something profound. I no longer knew this man. Perhaps I never had. The Daniel Matthews I had married, the man whose life had been intertwined with mine for a decade, was a carefully constructed fiction, a character he had created and maintained with the same meticulous attention he'd given to his financial schemes. The real question, which haunted me as I drove home that evening, wasn't why Daniel had betrayed me. It was whether the man I'd loved had ever existed at all. 3 days later, I found myself on a narrow dirt road in western Maine, approaching the lakeside cabin where Daniel and I had spent that formative weekend 12 years ago. The Bureau had secured permission to search the property, which was owned by a holding company now linked to Daniel's network of shell corporations. I had volunteered to lead the search, arguing that my familiarity with the property would make the operation more efficient. Whitman had agreed with reluctance, assigning Agent Chen to accompany me, both for operational support and, I suspected, to ensure my personal connection to the location didn't compromise the investigation. "Nice spot," Chen commented as we parked, near the rustic cedar cabin nestled among towering pines. "Wouldn't have pegged Matthews as the outdoorsy type." "He wasn't," I replied, gathering equipment from the trunk. That was part of its appeal for us. Somewhere completely disconnected from work, from Boston, from our regular lives. A sanctuary, I didn't add. A place where we had talked about children, about growing old together, about the kind of life we wanted to build. Promises as substantial as morning mist, evaporating in the heat of Daniel's ambition and deceit. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. A single great room with a stone fireplace, a modest kitchen along one wall, a sleeping loft accessible by ladder, and a screened porch overlooking the lake. It smelled of pine and wood smoke and memories I wasn't prepared to confront. "Where's this hidden compartment he mentioned?" Chen asked. "All business." I moved to the window seat beneath the largest window, which framed the lake view like a living painting. "Under here, the cushion lifts out, and there's a space beneath the bench." Together we removed the cushion, revealing the hand-hewn pine bench. I ran my fingers along the edge until I found the nearly invisible seam, then pressed in the precise spot I remembered. The false bottom released with a soft click. "Impressive craftsmanship," Chen noted as we lifted out the panel. Inside the compartment lay an old-fashioned metal cash box, not the romantic promise box Daniel and I had used years ago, but something newer, more substantial. Beside it was a white envelope with my name written in Daniel's distinctive handwriting. Chen photographed everything in situ before we removed the items. The cash box required a key we didn't have, so it would need to be opened at the lab. The envelope, however, contained only a letter, evidently meant for me alone. I'll need to review that as evidence, Chen said apologetically. Of course. I handed him the sealed envelope, professional obligations overriding personal curiosity. Whatever final message Daniel had left for me would first be processed, documented, and analyzed for evidentiary value. We completed our search of the cabin, finding nothing else of investigative significance. As we prepared to leave, I paused on the porch, looking out at the lake where Daniel and I had swum on summer mornings, had canoed at sunset, had told each other truths, or what I had believed were truths. "You okay?" Chen asked quietly. "Fine," I replied automatically, then amended, "Getting there." It was another week before the letter was cleared for me to read, determined to contain no coded instructions or information pertinent to ongoing financial traces. Whitman delivered it to my office personally, an unusual courtesy that signaled his concern about its potential impact. "You don't have to read it," he said, placing the evidence envelope on my desk. "Whatever explanation or justification Matthews has crafted, you're under no obligation to subject yourself to it." I appreciated his concern, but we both knew I would read it. Not from lingering emotional attachment, but from the same investigative instinct that had driven my career. The need to understand, to complete the picture, to leave no question unanswered if answers existed. "Thank you, sir. I'll be fine." After Whitman left, I stared at the envelope for several long minutes, preparing myself for whatever manipulation, justification, or plea it might contain. Finally, I broke the evidence seal and removed Daniel's letter, 5 pages of his precise handwriting, dated 2 months before his arrest. The letter began without preamble, as direct as Daniel himself had always been. "Rebecca, if you're reading. This, then everything has unraveled. I've been arrested or fled, or perhaps something worse has happened. Regardless, you now know truths I never intended you to discover, at least not this way. I won't insult your intelligence by claiming innocence. The financial crimes you've uncovered are real. The relationships you've discovered are real. The betrayals, all of them, are real. What I want to explain, if explanation is even possible, is how a man who truly loved you could also systematically deceive you for years. Because I did love you, Rebecca. That wasn't a lie." I paused, feeling the familiar surge of anger at these words. The claim of love alongside deception, as if the two could coexist, as if one didn't fundamentally negate the other. The financial fraud began 6 years ago. New clients with significant assets, pressure to deliver impossible returns, the temptation to temporarily shift funds to cover losses. You know how these schemes start. Small compromises that grow until they consume everything. But the deeper deception began earlier, before we even met. The man you married, successful, confident, self-made, was partly fiction from the beginning. My firm was struggling when we met. The client list I claimed, the assets under management, the trajectory of success, all exaggerated to varying degrees. I was a man drowning financially, but determined to project success at all costs. When you agreed to marry me, I promised myself I would make the fiction real. I would become the man you thought you were getting. And for a while, I believed I could. The first 3 years of our marriage, I worked obsessively to build legitimate success, to transform myself into the husband you deserved. But the financial crisis hit my over-leveraged investments particularly hard. Clients were leaving, losses mounting. I faced a choice: admit failure to you and everyone else, or find another way to maintain the illusion of success while I rebuilt. I chose the illusion. I set the letter down, breathing deeply to maintain composure. Even now, Daniel was casting himself as the tragic hero, a man driven to deception by circumstance rather than character, by external pressure rather than internal flaw. That first significant lie, hiding the firm's struggles from you, became the foundation for everything that followed. One deception required another, then another. Separate phones, separate accounts, manufactured business trips to cover meetings with increasingly nervous investors. A parallel professional life hidden from the woman who shared my bed. Then came Vanessa. I won't pretend she was anything but what she was. An affair, a diversion, an escape from the mounting pressure. She admired the fictional version of me I'd created, without the complexity of knowing the real me as you did. There's a seductive simplicity in being only the best version of yourself with someone, never having to reveal the complications, the failures, the doubts. I told myself it was temporary, a release valve for stress I couldn't share with you without revealing everything. I told myself I would end it once the financial situation stabilized. I told myself many things that weren't true. I continued reading, a detached clinical part of my mind noting how skillfully Daniel constructed his narrative, acknowledging enough truth to appear honest while subtly deflecting ultimate responsibility. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as his financial schemes had been. Elaine was different. I met her during what was supposed to be a client meeting in Burlington. She was the photographer documenting the charity event where I was speaking. We talked about her work, about Vermont, about building a life centered around passion rather than ambition. The conversation felt like stepping into another world, one without the crushing pressure of maintaining appearances, without the constant fear of discovery. When she told me she was pregnant, 3 months into our relationship, I should have ended it. Should have returned fully to our marriage, to you, to the life we'd built. Instead, I created a third compartment, financial criminal. In Boston, devoted husband in Beacon Hill, expectant father in Vermont. Michael was born, and something shifted in me. Holding my son, I experienced a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I began to believe I could fix everything, untangle the financial fraud, properly end things with Vanessa, find a way to integrate my relationship with Michael into some new version of life that wouldn't destroy you completely. Delusional, I know. The rationalization of a man who couldn't bear to lose anything, who believed he could manipulate reality indefinitely rather than face the consequences of his choices. The remaining pages detailed the escalating financial fraud, the increasing compartmentalization of his life, the elaborate systems he'd created to maintain his multiple realities. He described the offshore accounts in clinical detail, including access codes and contact information for various financial managers, information that might have seemed valuable to the investigation if we hadn't already uncovered most of it, through other means. It was the final paragraph that caught me off guard. I've left everything I can for Michael in trusts the government won't easily find or seize. Not the proceeds of fraud, legitimate investments made before things went wrong. He shouldn't suffer for my failures. As for you, Rebecca, I've arranged for $10 million in clean assets to be transferred to you upon specific triggering events. Not as recompense, nothing could compensate for what I've done to you, but as evidence that despite everything, my concern for your future was genuine. The documentation is in the box you've surely found by now. Do with it what you will. Keep it, donate it to my victims, burn it in effigy of our marriage. Like everything else now, it's your choice to make. I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and you're not inclined to grant it. But I will say this. In a life built on lies, what I felt for you was the closest thing to truth I've ever known. Daniel, I set the letter down, unexpectedly unmoved by his final declaration. Whatever emotional impact Daniel had hoped to achieve, understanding, absolution, perhaps even sympathy, had fallen flat against the reality of what I now knew about him, about us, about the elaborately constructed fiction I had called my marriage. The cash box from the cabin had indeed contained documentation for assets held in a Cayman Islands trust, established before the fraud began and technically not subject to seizure. The Bureau's forensic accountants had verified its legitimacy, approximately $9.8 million in diversified investments, with transfer mechanisms designed to activate upon Daniel's death or imprisonment exceeding 5 years. Legally, it appears to be yours. Whitman had informed me when the analysis was complete. No connection to victim funds, established with legitimate early earnings according to all available evidence. I had instructed him to find a way to add it to the victim restitution fund anyway. I wanted nothing from Daniel, not explanations, not apologies, and certainly not money that, while technically clean, was morally stained by its connection to a man who had built his entire life on deception. The main cabin, too, proved to be legitimately purchased with pre-fraud assets. I signed the paperwork transferring ownership to a conservation trust that would maintain it as part of a nature preserve, removing it from the landscape of my memories while ensuring it would benefit others in perpetuity. 3 months after Daniel's arrest, his case reached its legal conclusion with unexpected swiftness. Faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple cooperating witnesses, including Vanessa, he accepted a plea agreement, guilty on 17 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering in exchange for a recommended sentence of 12 years and full cooperation in recovering additional assets. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom as Judge Harrington delivered her decision. 12 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 85% of the sentence. Restitution payments totaling over $35 million. Permanent barring from the financial industry. Daniel stood impassively as the sentence was pronounced, his expression revealing nothing of what he might be feeling. Only once did he turn, scanning the courtroom until his eyes found mine. I met his gaze steadily, offering neither comfort nor condemnation, simply witness to the culmination of his choices. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with predictable questions about my presence at the hearing, about my knowledge of Daniel's crimes, about our marriage. I delivered the statement the Bureau's media team had prepared, emphasizing the focus on justice for victims rather than personal betrayal. The FBI is committed to ensuring that victims of financial fraud receive the maximum possible restitution, I concluded. Today's sentence advances that goal while holding the perpetrator accountable for significant violations of financial regulations and criminal statutes. Professional, impersonal, a complete elision of the personal devastation that had accompanied the case. As the media dispersed, I noticed a woman standing apart from the crowd, watching me with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Auburn hair, camera bag slung over one shoulder. Elaine Gregory. She approached cautiously, stopping several feet away, close enough for conversation but maintaining a respectful distance. "Agent Donovan," she said, her voice softer than I expected. "I'm Elaine Gregory." "I know who you are," I replied, keeping my tone neutral despite the surge of complex emotions her presence triggered. "I wanted to—" She paused, seemingly struggling to articulate her purpose. "I needed to see you, to tell you I didn't know about you until the arrest. Daniel told me he was divorced, that his ex-wife lived in Chicago. I never suspected." The familiar story, another woman deceived by the same man, another reality Daniel had meticulously constructed and maintained. Yet her situation differed from mine in one significant way. She had a child with him, a permanent connection that couldn't be severed by legal proceedings or emotional distance. "I believe you," I said simply. Whether it was true or not seemed less important than the grace of allowing her this dignity. Relief softened her features. "Thank you. I won't take more of your time. I just wanted you to know that." She turned to leave, then hesitated. "He told Michael about you after the arrest. Said his son should know that his father had been married to an extraordinary woman who deserved far better than what she got." The unexpected disclosure hit me with surprising force, not because it changed anything about Daniel's betrayal, but because it suggested a moment of genuine honesty from a man whose life had been built on lies. "Take care of your son," I said, the only response that felt appropriate. Elaine nodded, understanding the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "I will." I watched her walk away, this woman who had unknowingly shared a husband with me, who now faced raising a child whose father would spend his formative years in federal prison, another life irreversibly altered by Daniel's choices. As I drove home from the courthouse, I found myself thinking not about Daniel, or even about the unraveling of my marriage, but about the future that now stretched before me. Uncharted territory, free from deception, from compartmentalization, from the subtle but persistent feeling that something in my life wasn't quite aligned. The house I returned to was transformed. New furniture in the living room, new artwork on the walls, new bedding in the master bedroom. I had systematically replaced every significant item that carried memories of Daniel, creating a space that was wholly mine. The media attention would fade, the professional scrutiny would diminish, the immediate shock of betrayal would dull with time. What remained was the opportunity to rebuild, not the life I had thought I was living, but something new, something authentic, constructed on the foundation of hard-won truth rather than comfortable illusion. That evening, I sat on my newly purchased sofa, drinking tea from a mug that had never touched Daniel's lips, and allowed myself to acknowledge a surprising realization. Beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation, beneath the grief for a decade lost to fiction, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that the unexamined doubts, the subtle inconsistencies, the moments of disconnect that had occasionally troubled my marriage now had explanation. Relief that I was no longer unconsciously complicit in maintaining a reality built on sand. Relief, most fundamentally, to be free of a relationship with a man who had been capable of such comprehensive deception. My husband's mistress had called me on our anniversary to deliver what she thought would be devastating news. Instead, she had inadvertently accelerated my liberation from a life that had never been what I believed it to be. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the opportunity it presented to move forward not as Rebecca Matthews, wife of a successful investment manager, nor even as Agent Donovan, who had helped bring down a financial criminal, but simply as myself. Whole, uncompromised, and finally free to build a life unconstrained by someone else's carefully constructed fictions. 6 months after Daniel's sentencing, I stood in the doorway of my newly purchased condominium in Cambridge, watching movers carry in the last of my furniture. The Beacon Hill brownstone had sold quickly, a young tech executive and his wife enchanted by its historic details and prime location, blissfully unaware of the marital implosion that had necessitated the sale. I had disclosed the legal minimum about the property's history, letting the real estate attorney handle questions about why I was leaving a home most Bostonians would consider ideal. The truth was, despite the extensive redecorating, the brownstone had remained haunted by the ghost of my former life. Each room held memories I couldn't quite exorcise. Sunday mornings in the kitchen, evenings by the living room fireplace, the study where I'd first noticed the financial discrepancies that led to Daniel's unraveling. I needed a fresh start in a space untouched by deception. Cambridge offered that, a sleek, modern building near Harvard Square, equidistant from the Federal Building downtown in Quantico, where I'd recently begun teaching a specialized course on financial forensics 1 weekend a month. The new position had come at Whitman's suggestion, a recognition of the expertise I'd demonstrated throughout Daniel's case, and a subtle acknowledgement that a change of professional scenery might be beneficial. "Final delivery, Agent Donovan," the moving foreman called, bringing in a carefully wrapped painting, the only artwork I'd kept from my previous home, an abstract piece we'd found at a gallery in Provincetown, purchased before the marriage when possibilities still seemed endless and untainted. "You can put it against that wall for now," I directed. "I'll hang it later." As the movers completed their work, I signed the necessary paperwork and offered a generous tip. When the door closed behind them, I stood in the center of my new living room, surrounded by furniture arranged almost exactly as it had been in the staging photos that had attracted me to the unit. A deliberate choice, creating a space that felt designed rather than accumulated, intentional rather than inherited. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Housewarming still on for Saturday? I make a mean sangria. I smiled, typing back confirmation. The small gathering would serve as both celebration of my new home and informal farewell, as Diane was transferring to the Chicago field office the following month, a significant promotion. That would put her in charge of their financial crimes division. Setting my phone aside, I moved through the condominium, mentally placing the few personal items I'd brought with me, family photos, books, the small collection of art glass I'd begun acquiring in recent months. The space felt clean, uncluttered by history or expectation. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Checking the security panel, I was surprised to see Thomas Chen in the hallway, holding what appeared to be a potted plant. Housewarming isn't until Saturday, I said as I opened the door, but I appreciate the enthusiasm. Chen smiled, slightly embarrassed. I know, but I'm on surveillance in Harvard Square all weekend. Thought I'd drop this off early. He handed me the plant, a healthy-looking orchid. Low maintenance, nearly impossible to kill. Seemed appropriate for someone with your schedule. Thoughtful, I acknowledged, gesturing him inside. Want the tour? It's quick. 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, open-concept living area. Sure, he agreed, following me through the condominium with professional curiosity, noting security features and sightlines with the habitual awareness of a field agent. Nice place, he concluded. Good building security, decent escape routes if needed. Though the neighbors seem a little academic, I supplied, amused by his assessment. 2 physics professors and a literary critic that I've met so far. Considerably different from Beacon Hill's finance and old money demographic. That's probably refreshing, Chen observed, accepting the coffee I offered as we returned to the kitchen. I nodded, leaning against the counter. It is. No one here knows about Daniel or the case. I'm just another government employee with a sensible car and predictable hours. The anonymity had been deliberate. In Beacon Hill, the Matthews case had been neighborhood gossip for months, whispered. Conversations that stopped when I appeared. Overly solicitous inquiries about my well-being from people who had barely acknowledged me before scandal made me interesting. How's the new teaching position? Chen asked, changing the subject with the intuitive consideration that made him an excellent interviewer. Surprisingly enjoyable. The trainees are sharp, eager to learn the practical applications beyond textbook methodology. What I didn't add was how therapeutic the teaching had proven, transforming the painful expertise gained through Daniel's case into something constructive, using my personal experience to help future agents identify the subtle indicators of financial fraud that might otherwise go unnoticed. Chen nodded. Whitman mentioned you're being considered for the Financial Crimes Task Force leadership when Peterson retires next year. This was news to me. First, I'm hearing of it. Probably wanted to let you get settled before bringing it up. But the director was impressed with how you handled the Matthews case, professionally and personally. I absorbed this information, considering its implications. The task force leadership was a prestigious position, overseeing complex investigations across multiple jurisdictions. That I was being considered despite my personal connection to a high-profile case suggested my professional reputation had not only survived, but potentially been enhanced by the Matthews investigation. I'll have to think about it, I said non-committally. For now, I'm focused on establishing new routines. Chen understood my reticence. Fair enough. But for what it's worth, no one at the Bureau questions your capabilities. If anything, walking through fire tends to forge stronger agents. After Chen left, I placed the orchid on my kitchen counter, the first living thing in my new space beyond myself. Its quiet elegance seemed a fitting symbol for the life I was carefully constructing. Refined, resilient, requiring attention, but not constant fussing. I spent the remainder of the day unpacking essentials, arranging my home office, and preparing for my return to active casework the following Monday. The Matthews investigation had required my full attention for months, but with Daniel's sentencing complete and asset recovery transitioning to the specialized financial team, I had been assigned to a new series of investment fraud cases, none with personal connections, all benefiting from the heightened awareness I now brought to financial deceptions. That evening, I walked to a small bistro 2 blocks from my building, taking dinner at the bar with a book for company, a routine I'd established in recent months, reclaiming solitude as a choice rather than a condition imposed by betrayal. The bartender, a gray-haired woman with knowing eyes, placed my usual Sauvignon Blanc beside my plate. "How's the move going, Agent Donovan?" "Rebecca, please," I corrected gently. "And it's going well. Almost settled." "Good to hear." She wiped down the bar with practiced efficiency. "You know, I've been working this bar for 20 years, seen all kinds of people going through all kinds of transitions. The ones who make it are the ones who decide their story isn't finished just because one chapter ended badly." I smiled at the bartender's wisdom, delivered with the unassuming directness of someone who had observed humanity from behind a bar for decades. "I'm pretty sure my story still has quite a few chapters left." "Damn right it does," she affirmed, moving away to serve another customer. Later that night, as I prepared for bed in my new master bedroom, a serene space with windows overlooking a small courtyard garden, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the shocking phone call from Vanessa to the complete dismantling of the life I had believed was mine, through the professional challenge of maintaining investigative integrity while navigating personal devastation, to this moment of quiet, reinvention in a space that existed entirely on my own terms. The anger that had initially fueled me had evolved into something more nuanced. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of detached understanding. Daniel's choices had been his own, shaped by weaknesses I couldn't have fixed and desires I couldn't have fulfilled. The elaborate deception he had maintained spoke more about his character than about my failure to recognize it sooner. I had stopped asking myself how I had missed the signs, stopped blaming myself for trusting the man I had married. Instead, I focused on the clarity that had emerged from the destruction, a deeper understanding of my own resilience, capabilities, and desires for the future. My secure phone buzzed on the nightstand, Whitman's number appearing on the screen. At 11:17 p.m., this wouldn't be a social call. "Donovan," I answered, already mentally shifting into professional mode. "Sorry to disturb you after hours," Whitman said without preamble. "But we've just received intelligence you should be aware of. Victor Markham's operation has expanded into cryptocurrency manipulation. The Singapore connection you identified in the Westlake case appears to be central to the laundering mechanism." Victor Markham, the investment advisor I'd been investigating, before Daniel's case consumed my attention. The Westlake connection had been tenuous when I'd last worked on it, but clearly my initial instincts had been correct. "I'll review the files first thing tomorrow," I promised, already mentally cataloging what I remembered about Markham's operation. "Good. And Donovan." Whitman paused briefly. "The director approved your reinstatement to lead investigator status. This is your case if you want it." The offer represented a vote of confidence, an acknowledgement that I was ready to resume my career trajectory after the personal and professional disruption of the Matthews case. "I want it," I confirmed without hesitation. After ending the call, I didn't immediately return to bed. Instead, I moved to the living room windows, looking out at the Cambridge skyline, a different view from Beacon Hill, but no less compelling. Lights glimmered in windows across the cityscape, each representing lives in progress, stories unfolding, some honest, some deceptive, all complex in their human dimensions. Somewhere in that city, financial criminals like Victor Markham operated in the shadows, constructing elaborate schemes to enrich themselves at others' expense. And somewhere within me, the instincts and expertise that had been painfully honed through Daniel's case stood ready to unravel those schemes, to expose those shadows to light. My husband's mistress had called on our anniversary to deliver what she thought was a devastating blow. Instead, she had unwittingly set in motion a sequence of events that had stripped away illusion and pretense, leaving behind a clearer version of myself, professionally sharpened, personally tempered, uniquely qualified to recognize deception in its many forms. Tomorrow, I would begin reviewing the Markham files, applying that hard-won clarity to a new case, a new challenge. The view from Cambridge might be different, but my purpose had never been more focused: to uncover truth, no matter how deeply buried or carefully disguised it might be, not despite what had happened with Daniel, but because of it. I arrived at the Federal Building at 6:30 the next morning, eager to immerse myself in the Markham case before the daily operational bustle began. The security guard at the entrance, a retired Boston PD officer named Miguel who had watched the Matthews saga unfold from a discreet distance, nodded with quiet approval. "Early bird, Agent Donovan," he commented, returning my credentials. "Good to see you back in the saddle." The metaphor might have been cliché, but the sentiment behind it was genuine. Throughout the Bureau, there had been a collective holding of breath, wondering if the Matthews case would define me, diminish me, or, as now seemed evident, distinguish me in ways no one had anticipated. The Financial Crimes Unit occupied the 7th floor, a labyrinth of cubicles, conference rooms, and specialized forensic stations. At this hour, it stood largely empty, the overhead lights still dimmed to their night setting. I made my way to my office, not the same one I'd occupied before Daniel's arrest, but a corner space with better sightlines and proximal access to the analytical team. The reassignment had come during my partial secondment to Quantico, a quiet acknowledgement of my elevated status within the unit. The Markham files awaited me, physical documentation in precisely organized folders, digital evidence on secured servers, and the analytical frameworks I'd begun developing before my attention had been diverted. I spent the first hour reacquainting myself with the baseline facts of the case. Victor Markham, 52, founder of Zenith Capital Advisors, managing approximately $1.3 billion in assets for high-net-worth clients. Impeccable educational credentials, strategic philanthropic profile, and a concerning pattern of investment returns that defied statistical probability. Unlike Daniel, whose fraud had been relatively straightforward despite its scope, Markham operated with sophisticated precision. His apparent success wasn't built on simple theft disguised by false statements, but on complex market manipulations that exploited regulatory gaps and technological advantages. "Thought I might find you here before dawn," Whitman said from the doorway, 2 coffee cups in hand. He set one on my desk. Black, no sugar, just as I preferred. "Catching up on Markham?" I nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. The cryptocurrency angle explains some of the anomalies I couldn't reconcile initially. His traditional investment returns were impressive but theoretically possible. Add in undisclosed crypto manipulation, and suddenly the mathematical impossibilities. "Makes sense," Whitman finished. "The Singapore connection is particularly concerning. Evidence suggests he's using a technology platform there to execute micro-timing trades ahead of conventional market movements." I pulled up the relevant documentation on my computer, examining the transaction patterns with fresh eyes. Front-running at scale, disguised as algorithmic efficiency. Clients wouldn't even recognize it as fraud. They're seeing positive returns, just not the full returns their investments should be generating. Exactly. It's elegant compared to Matthew's brute force approach. The casual mention of Daniel no longer triggered an emotional response, just a clinical recognition of different criminal methodologies. Progress of a sort. "The victims don't even know they're victims," I observed, seeing the brilliance in Markham's approach. They're grateful for above-market returns, unaware they should be receiving even more. Whitman nodded, leaning against the doorframe. That's why we need someone who can see the patterns within patterns. Someone with your particular perspective. The implication was clear. My experience with Daniel had sharpened my ability to recognize sophisticated deception, to see beyond the carefully constructed facade to the truth beneath. I'll need technical support on the cryptocurrency tracking, I said, already mentally assembling my investigative team. Chen for the Singapore connection, Rodriguez for the regulatory framework analysis. Approved, Whitman replied without hesitation. Full resources, priority clearance, the directors taken a personal interest in this one. After Whitman departed, I remained at my desk, methodically working through the Markham documentation, identifying patterns and anomalies with the practiced eye of someone who had learned, personally and professionally, how deception operates at its most sophisticated levels. By noon, I had outlined an investigative approach that would target Markham's operation through multiple vectors simultaneously: financial forensics, technical surveillance, confidential informants within the cryptocurrency exchange community, and targeted examination of the Singapore technology platform. I was preparing to brief the assembled team when my secure phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know what Markham is doing. I can prove it. Meet me at the Harbor Walk, Northern End, 7 p.m. tonight. Come alone. Protocol dictated immediate reporting of such communication, particularly given its connection to an active investigation. I forwarded the message to Whitman and the technical security team, who would attempt to trace its origin while developing a secure approach to the proposed meeting. Within an hour, we had established a plan. I would attend, wearing concealed surveillance equipment, with tactical support positioned discreetly along the harbor walk. The message origin remained untraceable, sent through multiple anonymizing services, suggesting technical sophistication beyond ordinary whistleblower capabilities. The investigation was accelerating faster than anticipated, introducing elements of unpredictability that would require careful navigation. As I continued preparing for both the team briefing and the evening's uncertain meeting, I recognized a familiar sensation: the focused alertness that came with pursuing complex financial crimes, the intellectual engagement of tracking deception, through its deliberate obfuscation. This was what I had trained for, what I excelled at, what had drawn me to the Financial Crimes Unit initially. The Matthews case had been an unwelcome detour into personal terrain, a collision of professional expertise and private betrayal. The Markham investigation represented a return to purpose, challenging, consequential, but fundamentally external, to my personal life. As I reviewed the final briefing materials, I felt a sense of restoration, not of the life I had lost, which remained irrecoverable, but of the professional identity that had always been my true foundation. Whatever awaited at the Harbor Walk that evening, I would meet it not as Rebecca Matthews, survivor of betrayal, but as Special Agent Donovan, financial crimes specialist, uniquely qualified to recognize deception in its most sophisticated forms. Daniel's betrayal had nearly destroyed me personally, but professionally, it had transformed me into something more formidable than before. An investigator who had experienced deception from the inside out, who understood its patterns and psychological underpinnings with rare intimacy. Victor Markham, with his elegant financial schemes and technical sophistication, would soon discover exactly what that transformation meant for those who chose to operate in the shadows of financial fraud. The Harbor Walk stretched nearly empty in the early evening chill, October winds sweeping across Boston's waterfront as I approached the designated meeting point. My concealed weapon pressed reassuringly against my side. Tactical teams positioned invisibly along the route, earpiece silent but active. I spotted him immediately, not a nervous whistleblower as we'd anticipated, but a composed figure in a tailored overcoat staring out at the darkening water. Michael Kimball, Markham's former chief technology officer, who had disappeared 3 months earlier amid rumors of internal disputes. "Agent Donovan?" he acknowledged without turning. "Thank you for coming. You have information about Markham?" I kept my distance, assessing. He finally faced me, extending a small drive. "Everything you need to bring down Zenith Capital. The algorithm that executes the front-running trades, server locations, offshore accounts. Markham's entire operation, documented over 2 years." "Why come to me specifically?" I asked, not reaching for the drive yet. A thin smile. "Your reputation. The Matthews case demonstrated your thoroughness, even when personally affected. You've been watching me. I needed to be certain you wouldn't be compromised. Markham has federal connections, regulatory officials, a judge, possibly even someone in your building. The implications were significant, not just fraud, but corruption extending into law enforcement." I took the drive, securing it in an evidence pouch. "Markham knows I have this documentation," Kimball continued. "He's accelerating his exit strategy. You have 72 hours at most before the money vanishes permanently, 3 days to analyze the evidence, identify corrupt officials, and move against a sophisticated operation with high-level protection. The scale dwarfed Daniel's crimes by orders of magnitude." "I'll need your formal statement," I began. But Kimball was already shaking his head. "My statement is on the drive, fully documented. I won't be available after tonight." He checked his watch. "My flight leaves in 90 minutes. I suggest you move quickly, Agent Donovan." He walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness before surveillance could reposition. 48 sleepless hours later, I stood in the director's office in Washington, the evidence laid out before the assembled task force. Kimball's documentation had revealed not just financial fraud, but a network of corruption spanning multiple agencies, the largest conspiracy in the Bureau's financial crimes history. "We move simultaneously against all targets," the director confirmed. "Agent Donovan will coordinate the primary operation against Markham." As I left the briefing, Whitman fell into step beside me. "You know what this means for your career if this succeeds." I nodded, thinking not of promotions or commendations, but of the path that had led me here. A devastating phone call from a mistress that had ultimately positioned me to uncover a conspiracy affecting thousands of victims. "Sometimes our greatest strengths come from surviving what should have broken us," I said quietly. The next morning, as dawn broke over Boston Harbor, I led a team of 20 agents into Zenith Capital's headquarters, the weight of my FBI windbreaker familiar and right against my shoulders. "FBI, Victor Markham, you're under arrest." My husband's mistress had inadvertently set me on this path. Now I walked it with purpose, no longer defined by betrayal, but by the truth I was uniquely positioned to uncover. The flash drive Kimball gave me wasn't just evidence. It was a digital Pandora's box that shattered everything we thought we knew about Markham. 72 sleepless hours later, I stood in the director's secure conference room, facing not just Bureau leadership, but representatives from Treasury, SEC, and the White House National Security Council. "What we're looking at isn't merely financial fraud," I explained, projecting Kimball's decrypted files onto the screen. "Markham's operation is a sophisticated money laundering mechanism for 3 hostile foreign intelligence services." Stunned, silence filled the room as I displayed the network visualization. A web of transactions spanning 27 countries, billions in dark money flowing through seemingly legitimate investment funds. "The cryptocurrency platform is designed to scrub intelligence funding before it enters Western financial systems," I continued. "Markham isn't just stealing from clients. He's facilitating espionage operations against our own government." The director leaned forward. "And the domestic corruption?" "Worse than we thought." I brought up personnel files, judges, regulators, even 2 senior FBI officials. Markham's tentacles reach into every agency that could have stopped him. How do we proceed without tipping off the corrupted personnel? The Treasury Secretary asked. We don't, I replied simply. We move simultaneously against all targets. Tonight. As the unprecedented operation unfolded across 3 continents, I led the primary team into Markham's Boston penthouse. He looked, unsurprised as we entered, almost serene. Agent Donovan, he acknowledged, casually sipping scotch. I wondered who would finally see the pattern. Fitting it should be you. Why's that? I asked, securing his hands with cuffs. His smile was cold. Because only someone who's been thoroughly deceived develops the eyes to truly see deception. Your husband did you a favor in the end. I met his gaze unflinchingly. No, I did that for myself.